Tonight, what we are witnessing is not just a military defeat. It is the extraordinary annihilation of 15,000 Russian soldiers lured into a carefully prepared killing zone in Russia's own Kursk region and systematically destroyed by Ukrainian forces, executing one of the most devastating ambushes in modern warfare. Because when Ukraine feigns retreat, when Russian commanders believe they are pursuing a fleeing enemy, when they mass forces in a salient surrounded on three sides by Ukrainian artillery, the world takes notice. What we are seeing now is something as calculated as it is catastrophic for Russia, a death trap sprung with precision timing. Imagine this scene. February 9th, 2026, 8:15 a.m. local time. The Kursk salient, a bulge of Russian territory that Ukrainian forces have held since their audacious incursion began in August 2024. For 3 days, Ukrainian forces have been conducting what appears to be a fighting retreat, pulling back from advanced positions, allowing Russian forces to push forward into territory Ukraine had previously controlled. Russian commanders, eager to reclaim lost ground and believing they have finally broken Ukrainian defenses, pour reinforcements into the salient. 15,000 soldiers, armor columns, artillery batteries, supply vehicles, all flooding into what they think is a breakthrough. Then, at precisely 8:15, the trap springs. Ukrainian artillery, positioned in concealed locations on the salient's flanks, opens fire simultaneously from 3 directions. HIMARS rockets rain down on Russian supply routes, cutting off retreat and reinforcement. 777 howitzers pound Russian troop concentrations. Drone-guided artillery strikes individual vehicles with precision. Within minutes, what looked like Russian advance becomes Russian catastrophe. And within hours, 15,000 Russian soldiers find themselves not pursuing a defeated enemy but surrounded, cut off, and facing annihilation. Think about that. For 3 days, Ukrainian forces conducted a calculated retreat, allowing Russian commanders to believe they were winning, encouraging them to commit more forces, luring them deeper into a salient that Ukrainian artillery had pre-targeted with extraordinary precision. Every position the Russians occupied had been ranged. Every road they advanced along had been mapped. Every concentration point had been identified. Ukrainian forces were not retreating. They were baiting a trap. And when that trap closed, it closed with devastating totality. Here's the first hook. Military historians study great ambushes for centuries. Hannibal at Cannae, surrounding and destroying Roman legions through tactical brilliance. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, where Germanic tribes lured Roman legions into wooded terrain and annihilated them. These are the moments when cunning defeats strength, when patience overcomes aggression, when the hunted becomes the hunter. And on February 9th, in the Kursk region of Russia itself, Ukraine added its name to that list of legendary ambushes. This is not just another headline about casualties or territorial changes. It is about the moment when feigned weakness becomes devastating strength, when retreat becomes trap, when the enemy's confidence becomes the instrument of his destruction. When Ukraine lures 15,000 Russian soldiers into a carefully prepared killing zone and then systematically annihilates them with artillery fire so precise and overwhelming that survival becomes impossible, history teaches us one undeniable truth. Superior numbers mean nothing when you walk into an ambush. And pride, the belief that your enemy is beaten when they are merely baiting you, is the deadliest vulnerability of all. The retreat was theater. The advance was suicide. And 15,000 Russian soldiers, believing they were pursuing victory, discovered too late that they were marching into their own graves. For centuries, the pattern has been the same. When armies grow overconfident, when commanders mistake enemy repositioning for defeat, when forces advance without adequate reconnaissance into terrain the enemy knows intimately, catastrophe follows. From Hannibal's masterpiece at Cannae in 216 BCE, where he allowed Roman forces to push into his center while his cavalry enveloped their flanks, to the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE, where Arminius lured 3 Roman legions into dense forest and systematically destroyed them, the lesson is consistent. The appearance of weakness can be the setup for devastating ambush. Hannibal's victory at Cannae destroyed an army of 86,000 Romans through pure tactical genius. He deliberately weakened his center, allowing Roman forces to push forward, believing they were breaking through, while his stronger flanks encircled them. By day's end, 70,000 Roman soldiers lay dead, killed not because they were cowardly, but because their commanders failed to recognize the trap until it was too late. It remains one of history's most studied military disasters. Arminius at Teutoburg Forest executed a different but equally devastating ambush. He convinced Roman commanders he was a loyal ally, then led 3 legions into dense Germanic forests where Roman formations could not deploy effectively. Over 3 days, Germanic warriors attacked from concealment, systematically destroying units that could neither see their attackers nor maneuver to defend themselves. 20,000 Roman soldiers died, and the legion's eagles were lost, a humiliation Rome never forgot. These were moments when mythology was born from massacre, when overconfidence met cunning, when the powerful marched into traps prepared by those they underestimated. And now, in 2026, that ancient lesson is being taught again in the Kursk region, where Russian forces walked into an ambush prepared by Ukrainians they believed were retreating in defeat. For nearly 2 years, Ukraine's incursion into Russia's Kursk region has been one of the war's most audacious and consequential operations. Launched in August 2024, Ukrainian forces crossed the border and seized hundreds of square kilometers of Russian territory, creating a strategic dilemma for Moscow and demonstrating that Ukrainian forces could operate effectively on Russian soil. The incursion forced Russia to divert troops from other fronts, disrupted Russian logistics, and delivered a massive psychological blow to the Kremlin. But holding territory inside Russia comes with challenges. Supply lines stretch across the border. Russian forces constantly pressure Ukrainian positions. The salient that Ukrainian forces created becomes vulnerable to envelopment if Russian forces attack from multiple directions. Ukrainian commanders have known since the incursion began that managing this salient would require not just holding ground, but actively shaping Russian responses. And yet, Ukrainian military planners saw opportunity in vulnerability. If Russian forces could be encouraged to mass in the salient, if they could be lured into concentrating forces in a confined area surrounded by Ukrainian artillery positions, the same geography that made the salient vulnerable could make it a killing zone for Russian troops. The plan was audacious and required extraordinary discipline. Conduct a staged retreat, allow Russian forces to advance, and then annihilate them with pre-planned artillery strikes. Intelligence reporting suggests Ukrainian military leadership began planning this operation in late December 2025. The objective was not just tactical victory, but strategic impact. Destroy enough Russian forces that Moscow's ability to pressure the Kursk salient would be severely degraded for months. The plan required Ukrainian troops to retreat convincingly, to abandon positions they had fought to capture, to appear defeated while actually preparing devastation. Let's be honest. This kind of military operation requires extraordinary trust between commanders and frontline forces. Soldiers ordered to retreat, to give up ground they bled for, must trust that the retreat serves a larger purpose. Officers implementing the plan must maintain perfect operational security, ensuring that Russian intelligence does not detect the deception. Artillery units must be positioned, supplied, and ready to fire on extremely short notice when the trap springs. But here's the truth: Ukrainian forces have demonstrated repeatedly they are capable of this level of sophistication. Unlike Russian forces, which rely on rigid command structures where initiative is punished and deviation from orders is forbidden, Ukrainian forces have adopted Western-style mission command. Commanders at all levels understand the overall objective and have authority to make tactical decisions to achieve it. This flexibility, this trust in subordinate commanders, enables complex operations like the Kursk ambush. And yet, despite Ukrainian capabilities, Russian commanders walked into the trap, believing Ukrainian retreat indicated exhaustion or demoralization. Assuming that massing forces for a major push would break Ukrainian resistance, failing to conduct adequate reconnaissance that might have revealed Ukrainian artillery positions waiting in ambush. The combination of Ukrainian cunning and Russian overconfidence created the conditions for catastrophe. There's a misconception spreading that the Kursk ambush was opportunistic, that Ukraine simply got lucky when Russian forces happened to mass in a vulnerable location. But that completely misses the operational sophistication. What Ukraine executed was a deliberate deception operation, carefully planned over weeks, requiring precise timing and perfect coordination across multiple domains. This was not luck. This was masterful military art. The staged retreat began on February 6th, 3 days before the trap was sprung. Ukrainian forces in forward positions began pulling back, conducting fighting withdrawals that appeared convincing but were actually calculated. Artillery that had been supporting forward positions was repositioned to the flanks, hidden in forested areas where Russian reconnaissance would not detect it. Supply lines that appeared to be struggling with resupply were actually stockpiling ammunition for the massive artillery barrage to come. Here's the second hook. What makes this extraordinary is how Ukrainian forces maintained the deception while preparing the ambush. Radio communications were kept intentionally sparse, with some units maintaining radio silence to suggest disorganization. Visible defensive positions were partially dismantled, leaving equipment that suggested hurried retreat. Some units were ordered to simulate panic, abandoning non-critical equipment in ways that Russian intelligence would interpret as breakdown in unit cohesion. Intelligence assessments from Western agencies paint a picture of brilliant execution. According to sources familiar with classified intercepts, Russian military intelligence reported to commanders that Ukrainian forces in Kursk were exhausted and demoralized, that defensive positions were crumbling, that a major push could break Ukrainian lines. These assessments, exactly what Ukrainian planners wanted Russia to believe, convinced Russian commanders to commit massive forces to what they thought was a breakthrough operation. Satellite imagery from the days before the ambush shows Russian force buildup, armor columns moving toward the Kursk salient, artillery batteries being positioned, supply depots being established to support offensive operations. From space, it looked like Russia was preparing a major assault to reclaim lost territory. But Ukrainian commanders, watching through their own surveillance, saw Russian forces concentrating exactly where Ukrainian artillery had been carefully positioned to destroy them. Think about that. Ukrainian planners were able to predict Russian responses so accurately that they positioned artillery days in advance to target concentrations that did not yet exist but would exist when the trap was sprung. This level of operational planning, this ability to think multiple moves ahead and shape enemy decisions, demonstrates military sophistication that rivals any army in the world. What many don't realize is how many systems had to work perfectly for this ambush to succeed. Reconnaissance drones needed to provide constant surveillance of Russian movements. Artillery needed to be positioned and supplied without detection. Infantry needed to conduct the staged retreat convincingly while maintaining combat readiness. Command and control needed to coordinate the spring of the trap across multiple units simultaneously. A failure at any point could have alerted Russian forces to the deception or reduced the ambush's effectiveness. From a strategic standpoint, the success of the ambush validates Ukraine's approach to military operations. Rather than trying to match Russia soldier for soldier or tank for tank, Ukraine uses intelligence, planning, and precision to create situations where Russian advantages become liabilities. Russian willingness to mass forces, normally an advantage, becomes a vulnerability when those forces mass in a kill zone. Russian aggressive tactics, normally effective against weaker opponents, become suicidal when the opponent has prepared an ambush. The timing of the trap's execution was critical. Ukrainian commanders waited until Russian forces had committed deeply into the salient, far enough that retreat would be difficult, but before Russian forces could secure flanking positions that might threaten Ukrainian artillery. At 8:15 a.m. on February 9th, when Russian forces were most concentrated and most vulnerable, Ukrainian artillery opened fire from 3 directions simultaneously. The barrage was overwhelming. HIMARS rockets struck first, targeting roads and bridges that Russian forces would need for retreat, creating instant chaos and cutting off escape routes. M777 howitzers followed, firing pre-planned missions against Russian troop concentrations. Drone-guided artillery struck high-value targets. Command vehicles, ammunition trucks, electronic warfare systems. The coordination was perfect, the timing devastating, the effect catastrophic. For months, the images have been haunting. Russian artillery pounding Ukrainian cities, Russian missiles striking civilian infrastructure, Russian forces attacking, always attacking, believing that aggression en masse would overwhelm Ukrainian resistance. The narrative that Russia wanted to establish was one of inevitable victory, of Ukrainian forces constantly retreating, of a war that Russia would win through sheer persistence and willingness to accept casualties. But narratives built on lies collapse when confronted with reality. And the reality in the Kursk salient on February 9th was that Ukrainian forces were not defeated, not demoralized, not collapsing. They were waiting, watching, preparing to spring a trap that would annihilate the Russian forces foolish enough to walk into it. The hunters had become the hunted. The pursued had become the pursuers. And the price for Russian overconfidence would be measured in thousands of lives. Think about that. For 3 days, Russian soldiers advanced into the Kursk salient, believing they were winning, believing that Ukrainian resistance was breaking, believing that final victory was within reach. Officers reported successes to their commanders. Commanders reported progress to Moscow. Moscow celebrated the impending recapture of lost territory. And all of it was based on Ukrainian deception, on a staged retreat designed to lure Russian forces into a death trap. Here's the third hook. There is something profoundly tragic about soldiers dying because their commanders failed to recognize a trap. The individual Russian soldiers advancing into the Kursk salient were not cowards or fools. They were following orders, doing what soldiers do. But their commanders, blinded by overconfidence and desperate for victories to report to Moscow, led them into an ambush that Ukrainian forces had prepared with extraordinary care. Those soldiers died not because they failed, but because their leadership did. What's truly extraordinary is how Ukrainian forces maintained discipline throughout the deception operation. It is psychologically difficult to conduct staged retreats, to give up ground you fought to gain, to allow enemy forces to advance when every instinct says to stand and fight. But Ukrainian soldiers trusted their commanders, executed the plan flawlessly, and demonstrated the kind of professional military discipline that Russian forces consistently lack. The human cost of the Kursk ambush is staggering. 15,000 Russian soldiers killed or wounded represents one of the single largest casualty events of the entire war. To put that in perspective, the United States lost 58,000 soldiers over more than a decade in Vietnam. Russia lost 15,000 in a single day in Kursk because commanders walked into an obvious trap. The scale is almost incomprehensible. From a psychological standpoint, the Kursk ambush delivers multiple devastating blows to Russian morale. First, it demonstrates that Ukrainian retreats may be deceptions, creating paranoia about pursuing Ukrainian forces. Second, it shows that massive force concentrations, traditionally a Russian tactical preference, can be turned into mass casualties when the enemy has prepared adequately. Third, it proves that even on Russian soil, Ukrainian forces can execute sophisticated operations that result in overwhelming Russian defeats. Intercepted communications from Russian forces after the ambush reveal confusion, despair, and rage. Units calling for support that never arrives because supporting units were themselves caught in the kill zone. Officers attempting to organize retreats but finding escape routes blocked. Soldiers questioning orders, questioning commanders, questioning why they were sent into an obvious death trap. The psychological damage exceeds even the physical casualties. This is where resilience meets retribution. For nearly 4 years, Ukrainian forces have endured Russian aggression, attacks on their cities, attempts to destroy their nation. They have adapted, learned, evolved into one of the world's most capable militaries. And in the Kursk salient, they demonstrated that they have not just survived Russian onslaught, but developed the capability to inflict catastrophic defeats on Russian forces through planning, deception, and devastating execution. There are moments when military deception becomes art form, when the careful orchestration of false signals, staged retreats, and pre-positioned fires creates a symphony of destruction. Ukraine's Kursk ambush is one of those moments. This is not just about killing enemy soldiers or reclaiming territory. This is about demonstrating that Ukrainian military thought has evolved to the point where they can predict Russian responses, shape Russian decisions, and create situations where Russian forces destroy themselves. The deception operation required extraordinary attention to detail. Ukrainian forces had to ensure that their retreat appeared genuine while maintaining the combat capability to spring the trap. This meant abandoning some equipment to make the retreat look authentic while secretly repositioning the artillery that would conduct the ambush. It meant conducting some genuine defensive engagements while avoiding others in ways that would encourage Russian advance. It meant managing communications to suggest disorganization while maintaining perfect coordination. Here's the fourth hook. Imagine being a Ukrainian artillery officer during this operation. For 3 days, you watch Russian forces advancing. Watch them massing in positions you have already targeted. Watch them walking into your kill zone. And you have to wait. You cannot fire early and reveal the trap. You must maintain discipline, maintain silence, maintain readiness while Russian forces concentrate in the exact locations where you will destroy them. That level of professional military discipline is extraordinary. Intelligence reports suggest that Ukrainian drone operators played a critical role in the operation's success. Small surveillance drones, flying at low altitude to avoid Russian air defense radar, provided real-time updates on Russian force movements. This allowed Ukrainian commanders to adjust artillery targeting right up until the moment the trap was sprung, ensuring maximum casualties when the barrage began. The integration of drones with artillery, something Ukrainian forces have mastered through necessity, proved devastatingly effective. Western military observers studying the Kursk ambush are drawing significant lessons about modern warfare. According to preliminary assessments shared with NATO allies, the operation demonstrates that precision fires combined with operational deception can achieve effects that previously required massive forces. Ukraine destroyed 15,000 Russian soldiers primarily through artillery, with relatively minimal direct infantry engagement. This represents a fundamental shift in how wars can be fought. What many don't realize is how this operation fits into Ukraine's broader strategic approach. For months, Ukrainian forces have been conducting what military theorists call economy of force operations, achieving maximum effect with minimum resources. Rather than trying to match Russian numbers, Ukraine creates situations where Russian numerical superiority becomes a liability. The Kursk ambush is the ultimate expression of this approach. Russia's willingness to mass forces became the instrument of its own destruction. From a tactical perspective, the execution phase of the ambush was textbook perfect. The simultaneous artillery fire from three directions created what military planners call a 360-degree kill zone, where enemy forces are taking fire from all sides and cannot identify safe directions for retreat. The cutting of retreat routes with HIMARS strikes ensured that Russian forces could not escape the kill zone. The focus on high-value targets like command vehicles degraded Russian ability to organize responses. The psychological impact of the ambush extends beyond immediate survivors. Every Russian unit that hears about Kursk will be more hesitant to pursue Ukrainian forces aggressively, will question whether retreats are genuine or traps, will be more cautious about concentrating forces. The paranoia created by one successful ambush can affect Russian operations across the entire front for months. This is where cunning defeats strength. Russia has more soldiers, more tanks, more artillery pieces than Ukraine. But Ukraine has better intelligence, better planning, better coordination, and commanders willing to take calculated risks like staging retreats to set ambushes. In the calculus of modern warfare, those advantages prove decisive. 15,000 Russian casualties in a single day demonstrate that quality of execution matters more than quantity of resources. We have seen throughout history that innovative tactics defeat conventional approaches. The Mongol feigned retreat, where cavalry would pretend to flee and then turn and destroy pursuers, confused and destroyed armies for generations. The German blitzkrieg, combining armor and air power in new ways, overwhelmed larger forces through speed and coordination. Ukraine's combination of precision artillery with operational deception represents a similar innovation, and Russia is paying the price for failing to adapt. In modern warfare, morale is as important as ammunition. Soldiers fight effectively when they trust their commanders, when they believe in their mission, when they think their sacrifices serve a purpose. And yet, what we are witnessing among Russian forces after the Kursk ambush is not just tactical defeat, but the collapse of the psychological foundations that keep armies functioning. Reports from Ukrainian intelligence, corroborated by intercepted communications and accounts from prisoners, paint a picture of Russian forces psychologically shattered by the Kursk disaster. Units refusing orders to advance, fearing that every Ukrainian retreat is another trap. Officers being killed by their own men in incidents Russian authorities try to conceal. Wholesale desertions as soldiers conclude that continuing to fight is suicidal. Here's the fifth hook. The mathematics of morale collapse are brutal and accelerating. When an army loses 15,000 soldiers in a single ambush, the effect extends far beyond those casualties. Surviving units know what happened. They know that their commanders led forces into an obvious trap. They know that the same could happen to them. And that knowledge, that fear, that loss of confidence in leadership spreads like infection through military ranks. Western intelligence agencies monitoring Russian communications report unprecedented levels of despair and anger among Russian forces. According to classified intercepts, multiple Russian units have reported refusal to advance incidents where soldiers collectively decided they would not follow orders into what they perceived as certain death. One intercepted conversation shows a Russian officer telling his commander, "The men will not advance. They say every retreat is a trap now. They say you are sending them to die like in Kursk." The scale of Russian casualties in Kursk also affects Russia's limited pool of trained soldiers. 15,000 casualties is not just 15,000 individuals. It is 15,000 trained infantry, artillery crews, tankers, officers. Many of these soldiers had combat experience, institutional knowledge, relationships with other units. Their loss degrades not just numbers but capability, not just strength but effectiveness. Satellite imagery from Russian military facilities inside Russia shows evidence of declining morale. Imagery from late February shows increased security at bases, suggesting concerns about desertion. Imagery of training facilities shows reduced activity, possibly indicating difficulty recruiting replacements. Even physical infrastructure associated with troop morale, like recreational facilities and canteens, shows reduced usage patterns, suggesting soldiers are not utilizing them normally. Because here is the truth about armies that suffer catastrophic defeats through commander incompetence. Soldiers lose faith not just in individual leaders, but in the entire command structure. When 15,000 soldiers die because commanders walk them into an obvious ambush, every surviving soldier questions whether their commanders will make similar mistakes. And that questioning, that loss of trust, corrodes military effectiveness more thoroughly than casualties alone. The Kursk ambush also affects Russian domestic morale. 15,000 casualties cannot be hidden. Families receive notification. Communities notice when multiple young men do not return. Social media, despite Russian censorship, spreads information about the disaster. And questions start being asked. Why did this happen? Who is responsible? How could commanders make such catastrophic mistakes? These questions undermine support for the war, even among Russians who previously supported it. Ukrainian forces, by contrast, have seen morale soar after Kursk. The operation demonstrated that Ukrainian commanders are brilliant strategists, that Ukrainian soldiers can trust their leadership, that patience and discipline yield devastating victories. Every Ukrainian soldier who participated in or heard about the Kursk ambush knows that their military is not just defending but winning through tactical superiority. Something deeper than military victory is unfolding, something that resonates beyond casualty counts and territorial control. It is a demonstration that intelligence defeats brute force, that planning overcomes aggression, that the defender fighting for survival on familiar terrain can devastate the attacker even when outnumbered. For 4 years, Russia has relied on mass, on willingness to accept casualties, on the belief that superior numbers guarantee eventual victory. But in the Kursk salient, those assumptions met their annihilation. When 15,000 Russian soldiers died walking into a Ukrainian ambush, when their commanders' overconfidence led them into a death trap prepared with extraordinary care, the world witnessed the failure of Russian military doctrine, centralized command that cannot adapt, aggressive tactics that become predictable, mass that becomes vulnerability when the enemy prepares adequately. All of the supposed strengths of Russian military tradition proved to be fatal weaknesses. Here's the sixth hook. This is not just about Ukraine defeating Russia in one battle. This is about the validation of an entire approach to warfare. Smaller forces with better intelligence, better coordination, and better leadership can defeat larger forces that rely on outdated doctrine and incompetent commanders. Every military in the world studying the Kursk ambush is learning that technological sophistication and tactical innovation matter more than raw numbers. Western capitals view the Kursk ambush as vindication of their support for Ukraine. The artillery systems that destroyed Russian forces were provided by Western nations. The training that Ukrainian officers received in NATO countries enabled them to plan and execute sophisticated operations. The intelligence that helped Ukraine predict Russian movements was partially provided by Allied surveillance systems. Western investment in Ukrainian military capability has yielded decisive results. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, skeptics questioned whether Ukraine could survive, much less win. 4 years later, Ukrainian forces are conducting sophisticated ambush operations on Russian soil that result in catastrophic Russian casualties. The transformation from desperate defense to offensive operations capable of annihilating Russian forces is as remarkable as it is encouraging for any nation facing aggression. The global implications extend beyond military considerations. Nations facing threats from larger neighbors see that size does not guarantee victory. Countries investing in defense see the value of quality over quantity. Military planners worldwide are studying Ukrainian tactics, Ukrainian training, Ukrainian innovations. The Kursk ambush will be taught in military academies for generations as an example of how to defeat a numerically superior enemy through cunning and preparation. The international order, challenged by Russian aggression, is being defended by Ukrainian resistance. The principle that invasion must be resisted, that aggression carries consequences, that defenders with skill and determination can defeat attackers with superior numbers, all of these principles are validated by operations like the Kursk ambush. 15,000 Russian casualties represent not just a tactical defeat, but a strategic failure of the entire philosophy that might makes right. When the artillery stops, when the survivors are counted, and the satellite imagery stops updating, what remains is a truth written in the soil of Russia's Kursk region. You can mass 15,000 soldiers for an offensive. You can believe that enemy retreats indicate defeat, but you cannot make those beliefs true when the enemy has prepared an ambush designed specifically to exploit your overconfidence. And you can command armies, can issue orders, can demand that soldiers advance, but you cannot make those soldiers survive when you lead them into traps that tactical competence would have avoided. Russia's strategy in Kursk was built on assumptions that proved catastrophically false. The assumption that Ukrainian forces were exhausted and demoralized. The assumption that Ukrainian retreats indicated breakdown rather than deception. The assumption that massing forces for major push would achieve breakthrough. And on February 9th, when those assumptions met Ukrainian artillery fire from 3 directions simultaneously, 15,000 Russian soldiers paid the price for their commanders' failures. This ambush has exposed the crumbling foundation of Russian military power. What appeared formidable, the willingness to mass forces and attack aggressively, has proven suicidal when facing a competent enemy. The tactics succeed against weak opponents but become mass casualties against Ukrainian forces that think several moves ahead. From a powerful army to 15,000 soldiers killed in a single ambush, the transformation reveals institutional failure at every level. And that's what makes this so devastating for Russia. The soldiers who died in Kursk were not defeated by superior numbers or better equipment. They were defeated by superior planning, by tactical brilliance, by commanders who thought circles around their Russian counterparts. Every casualty represents not just Russian loss, but Ukrainian tactical superiority. But if there is one thing the Kursk ambush has demonstrated, it is this. Modern warfare rewards intelligence over mass, planning over aggression, patience over impetuosity. The nation that thinks strategically, that shapes enemy decisions, that prepares kill zones and then lures enemy forces into them, defeats the nation that simply masses troops and attacks. So tonight, as Russian commanders attempt to explain how 15,000 soldiers walked into an obvious trap, as families across Russia receive notifications, as the scale of the disaster becomes undeniable, the most haunting truth is this: the trap was predictable, the ambush was foreseeable, Ukrainian capabilities were visible to anyone willing to look. And the catastrophe was entirely preventable if Russian commanders had shown even basic tactical competence. You can mass forces, but you cannot make them invulnerable to ambush. You can order soldiers to advance, but you cannot make them survive when you lead them into death traps. And you can believe that enemy retreats indicate defeat, but you cannot make that belief true when the enemy is baiting you into prepared kill zones. Russia's 15,000 casualties in Kursk are not just numbers. They are evidence of command failure, of tactical incompetence, of a military system that cannot adapt to face competent opponents. They are a testament to Ukrainian military sophistication that rivals any army in the world, and they are a warning that aggression, when it meets intelligence and preparation, becomes suicide. I'm Rachel Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.